I'm now going to pass you over to our director, Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Henry. You've heard a lot now about the different elements of policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the big ideas are of the coalition. But first we're going to start with a little bit of audience participation, and that's a strong poll here. I'm going to ask you how long you think this coalition is going to survive. Very contentious question. So will you put your hands up if you think it's not going to make it to 2 years? It won't see its second birthday. Okay, some skeptical. How many people think it will make it past 2 years? Oh, well, it's a resounding vote of confidence there for the future of the coalition. And I think the majority are right about this. And my strong impression from speaking to people at the very centre is that there is a very, very serious attempt to form a coherent agenda for government. A great excitement about that. I see people like Steve Hilton and Paul McKenzie working together very, very closely, almost a kind of mutual Stockholm syndrome is kicking in, kind of want to identify each other, we all love each other to death. And so there is an attempt to form a coherent agenda for government. But the problem with this is that we're trying to marry together two things that aren't quite finished. Both the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives haven't themselves quite enunciated what their big idea is, so marrying the two together is very tricky. Let's see what we already know. Okay, so the Conservatives have had a few goes at answering the question about what's the big idea. We had the post-bureaucratic age, a rather unlovely phrase, but a good idea. It's an idea about decentralisation, transparency, accountability. You can see that reflected in policies like school choice, like GP and hospital choice, and police accountability. We also had David Cameron's attempt to mend the broken society. Remember he said, there is no longer a need to mend our broken economy, there is a need to fix our broken society. And there have to be both, of course. But you can see the broken society agenda reflected in things like the marriage tax allowance, welfare reform agenda, and things that IDS is doing. Most recently of all, of course, we have this most contentious idea of the big society. And I think the big society is a sort of melange of the two preceding ideas, plus a dash of kind of community organisation and all those kind of cool things. There's an irony, I think, in the election that the big society presented to people as really a sort of an amalgam of various things that they like. Conservative activists are very motivated by police accountability. They like school choice. They like fixing broken society. When this is wrapped up in this wrapper we call big society, they say, oh, no, I don't like the sound of that. So there's a great a degree of misunderstanding about the big society. What the hell is the post-bureaucratic age anyway? There's a whole bunch of strands to it. One is about choice. So we talked about GP choice, school choice. Also potentially using personal budgets more to deliver those choices, to give people choice by putting the cash in their hands, giving them the choice about how to deliver social care, about skills funding, maybe going back to some of those kind of ideas. A big part of it is about data and accountability. You can see Francis Maud is already getting going on all this. Tomorrow we'll be publishing stuff about infection rates in hospitals. On Friday, we're going to publish the COINS database of all public spending. There are apparently 24 million lines in the COINS database. So, Andrew, you're working with Ken. There's a whole bunch of other data that we can put out there, and there's an interesting relationship between the publication of all this data and the choice agenda. So, if we publish data on MRSA infection rates in hospitals, and we give you a choice of hospitals, then we have a real force for improvement in the NHS. A number of big IT challenges behind this whole agenda, though. A lot of public sector IT is very, very weak, not able to support the kind of things that the government would like to do. Look at the failure of something like NOMS, for example. Look at the fact that the DWP's computer systems forget you if you've claimed welfare before, now you come walking back in the front door all over again, you don't know who you are. Court system, very, very weak, 1980s stuff. Police IT, very weak. A wider point about the post-bureaucratic age about moving from targets to incentives. And lots of different examples we could apply that to. It could be that we move from targets for recycling, awful tonnage targets that we've got at the moment that inspire all this kind of useless recycling by local authorities, to a proper payments by results type of system. We could think about the planning law reforms as an example of something that Policy Change pioneered. Instead of having this kind of soup-like system where we use Section 106 to kind of barter between local authorities and developers, we can have a proper modern capitalist democracy system where there is a straight fee for developing in different places. We could look in youth justice. Max has already talked a bit about payment by results for rehabilitation. There's also behaviour change type of policies, I think, are part of the post-bureaucratic age. We talked about the famous nudges, of course. Give people smart meters, they can see how much electricity they're using, they'll use less. Universities is a very important part of the agenda. I don't think it's actually fair to say to people, we're going to ask you to pay a lot more for your university tuition, but we're not going to tell you, how well our graduates do in terms of their earnings. We're not going to tell you what kind of tuition you get. And I think we do need to make universities publish the data that they're currently squatting on if we're going to have a proper market in universities. Of course, we could move from gentle kind of nudges, giving people more information, to what we might call shoves. We might give people little financial incentives to do things that might be about the household place. They might be building on the Eddington agenda of transport, trying to squeeze more capacity out of our existing transport networks rather than spending lots more money which we no longer have. So that could be about charging for road access, it could be about other kinds of charging. And of course, it's about democratic reforms, and the coalition is going to do a huge amount of this. Local referendums, right recall for MPs, 200 primary elections for MPs, mayors elected, local government potentially having its finance reformed, all of its ring-fenced funding consolidated into an old-fashioned block grant. The RDAs may be being axed, maybe not now, and the Lords wholly or mainly elected, of course, not to mention the famous referendum on AV. An agenda which I think is a little bit less well developed is this one about fixing broken society. So IDS did his first big speech the other day, set out his main priorities on welfare reform. Talked about improving work incentives. It's very difficult, of course, and you need to find the money to pay for it. Simplification itself is, of course, not simple. The Centre of Social Justice produced an excellent report by Stephen Bryan, who's now SPAD, looking at one way of simplifying the benefit system. We produced a sort of rival report, which is a simpler version of simplification, which would mean that anyone leaving welfare would always be £100 a week better off if they got a job. Very simple system. Increasing the retirement age, I think, is almost a no-brainer, very controversial, but has that happen? Welfare to work reform, eminent sensible things being done by the coalition here, bringing forward the point at which we put you into a welfare work scheme. We don't leave you for a whole year, we put you into these schemes for 6 months. Personally, I think there's an opportunity there to save some money in welfare to work services by doing a bit more like the Australians do, by looking at the types of people who are walking in the door of job centre and saying, well, this person looks like he's going to sort himself out. This other person over here is clearly not. So let's not wait for him to rot for 12 months on welfare, getting more and more difficult to employ. Let's get him doing welfare to work stuff now. Incapacity benefit, an absolute nightmare issue. IDS very bravely facing up to the truth that both parties have dumped people into IB over the years, and they're now going to be very difficult to get back into the labour market. Of course, the famous thing about incapacity benefit is the longer you stay on it, the sicker you really get. And the famous statistic, of course, being that if you've been on it for more than 2 years, even though 90% of them say they want another job, they're more likely to die or retire than ever work again. Sad indictment of 20 years of failed welfare policies, but something I hope we can make some progress on. Family policy, I think, is very up in the air. So I suppose the flagship policy, which has got all the attention, is, of course, the transferable tax allowance. But it's a very, very small sum of money. I think its advocates would say that it sends a signal it's not actually going to move a huge number of people into getting married. Reforming the couple pension benefit system, potentially much more powerful, much more focused, because of course it's poor people that don't get married. But the problem is that fixing the couple pension system, if you did it in its entirety, would cost £18 billion. £18 billion that, of course, we don't really have. So what's the answer in terms of family policy? Again, it's something I hope we will look at over the coming months. Interesting ideas, I think, by people like Julia Justice Wilson in the United States, looking at the employability of young men, particularly in areas of deprivation, thinking about that as a way of solving the breakdown of families. Other big questions, of course, Ian Douglas-Smith gave this huge long speech, all these different priorities, and I was left at the end of thinking, the terrible thing is there's all these other things you haven't talked about, sickness benefits, the rise of DLA, huge spending on all those kind of benefits, housing benefit, the real big dwarfing job seekers' allowance, dwarfing all the benefits you've heard of, and the interconnection between social housing and housing benefit, big thing to sort out. The tax credit system, very much a malfunctioning system. Income support, some very radical reforms there in the pipeline already, taking down the age at which we expect people to go back into work, having been blood parents. The causes of poverty, I think, are, this is where I thought IDS's speech today was most interesting. So we have done a number of pieces of policy change critiquing the approach to poverty of the last government, which is all about fixing the symptoms. You give people a certain amount of money, you move them over an arbitrary line. In the case of the last government, it was 60% of median equivalent household disposable income after housing costs. That is not my definition of poverty, but we need to reorientate government policy around the idea of fixing the causes of poverty. I guess I rightly identify them as education underachievement, drug problems, debt. But of course, at the moment, the government is saying that the last government's targets are all staying, and I think there is a tension there, and I think at some stage we need to move on from that approach. Okay, so what is going to happen now? Here are some little trends to think about. I think the coalition potentially has a stronger policy position than either party. If you think about the way that at the start of the negotiations, both sides dumped their least popular policies and took up the most. You can almost imagine the saying, "Oh no, don't let us dump that inheritance tax cut." "Oh no, don't force us to abandon migration amnesty. That's wonderful on the losses." So I think the coalition, if it ran against either of the two parties, would beat both of them. And some interesting new opportunities are going to open up for policymakers, novel view. For example, we're having a review of government finance, local government finance. You thought that would never happen. If there is ever going to be a reform of terrible, enfeebling system of local government finance we've got at the moment, it's going to have to be a kind of cross-party affair, and there's some opportunities there to think about other issues like drugs, where the coalition actually might have some opportunities that aren't open to a single-party government. Let's think about the politics of the cost of living too. So inflation is going up, and inflation interest rates are going to follow it, so people are going to be feeling pretty poor as well. Then, of course, their bills are going to go up. Policy Exchange recently produced a report saying that the bill for infrastructure spending in this country over the next 10 years is £500 billion. Now, our current plan, the plan of policymakers, is to dump that onto your bills, onto your train fare, to your water bill, onto your gas bill. And I almost like to wonder if people can pay. I also think that if the coalition goes ahead with its plans to increase VAT, the politics of the cost of living are going to become an acute political issue, because of course it's going to be, the government are going to be blamed for making everything so expensive. So there's going to be greater price sensitivity among voters and consumers, much greater focus, I think that means, on value for money. If I think about something like environmental policy, which is currently really run as if cost was no object. We have one carbon price is £4 a tonne, we have another carbon price is £440 a tonne. We are squandering a huge amount of money. We could reduce emissions by more for a lower cost. And I think the agenda about value for money is going to become very, very important. There's something about the character of coalition government too. People talk about being kind of government by review, and there are 45 different issues listed in the coalition agreement, which they will decide or evaluate or review or consider. That's 45 out of 400 different bullet points in the coalition agreement, so they are quite certain about some things. But nonetheless, I think there is something a bit more discursive, a bit slower, but also, I think, right about this kind of approach by a more technocratic approach where you think carefully before you make policies. Coming after a government which tried to give us the national landlords database and the dogs tax and the 10p rate, I think it's actually quite a good idea to think before you make policy. And there's a huge range of issues where there are genuine reviews. Some, of course, of the reviews are just ways of kicking things into long grass. I don't really think anything very significant is going to happen about human rights reform. But look at some of the others: energy markets, takeover law, corporate transparency, Glass-Steagall type arrangements, non-bonds, libel law, legal aid, control orders, betting and borrowing. All these different things are serious reviews. So the coalition really doesn't know what it's going to do, and there's a great opportunity for policy people, all of you, to have a huge impact as a result of that. One last very important thing to think about, we've already touched on it, the little issue of how we save some money. So the other day, the coalition launched its first $6 billion of spending cuts, or efficiency savings, or savings, as I like to call them. Reactions were unpredictable. Pure factorism says label this pushing us towards the death spiral, says Danny Blanchflower. Let's just think about that in a bit of perspective. This is spending before and after the cuts. Or rather, well, you can't really see the difference. The little tiny red lines there are the reductions. That's, of course, pure factorism, the death spiral. Let's put things in perspective as well. If we want to stick to Labour's plans to reduce the deficit, and just stick to those, we don't think they're enough, but let's stick to them. Just over the next Parliament, not beyond the next Parliament. Here are some uncontroversial ways of doing what we said we'll do. We could get rid of most of the welfare system, we could freeze all these benefits, scrap things like winter fuel payments, scrap free TV licenses, and then also raise some taxes. That would be pretty controversial. We could cut every single government department's budget by 12%, or as Andrew said, ring fence the NHS and then cut the rest 25%. Or we could do things more left where we could say, I don't know, why don't we just raise the basic rate of tax by 10 pence in pounds so that every single poor person in this country is paying super tax. Not really very palatable options, I think you'll probably all agree. But that is the implication of the current spending envelope. So I think the era of tinkering at the margins is over. The era of quite radical big things is here. This government is really kind of marching with the gun to its back because it can't afford not to do big radical things in the final analysis. The fiscal problem is that bad. So my final conclusion about all this is this: the era of small thinking is over. Thank all of you for coming today, and we're now going to move over and take some questions.